Okay, let's start. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for being here. We are very fortunate to have this today. Professor Caroline Nagel from the University of South Carolina is going to be speaking to us about the limits of the migration state, alienage, arbitrariness, and the U.S. asylum system. I'm really much looking forward to this talk. Before the presentation, a couple of points of housekeeping for you. Caroline will speak for 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions. If we can keep microphones muted throughout the speaker's presentation, and that will be handy. If you want to ask something, please do feel free to use the hand function, raise your hand, turn your camera on, and turn your microphone on, and ask those questions on screen. And if you do want to have your cameras during the presentation, please feel free to do so. I think it's nicer for Caroline to feel that you are talking to an audience rather than to a screen. Okay, the seminar is being recorded today and will be uploaded to YouTube later, so just be aware of that. If you have any questions or concerns, cameras off is probably the way to go. Okay, without any further ado, I will hand over to Caroline. Please take it away.
Great, thank you. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's nice to kind of be back, even if virtually, at Loughborough. Some of you in the audience, I know John Harrison, of course, but I'm not sure who else is out there, but I'm a former member of the geography staff at Loughborough, so it's nice to maintain the connection and to be back again. So thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it. So let me just get started here. I want to start just by kind of asking a basic question here about what is the border and how do borders work. And you know, this question has been discussed like almost ad nauseum by geographers and political scientists and others. And at this point, you would think that the answer to that question would be obvious. And in some ways, it is obvious at one level. In a modern interstate system, we've got borders to demarcate sovereign territory. Borders preserve sovereignty. They regulate who goes in and who goes out, and in some instances, what goes in, what and who goes in, and in some instances also what and who goes out. And there's these borders are really a key component of what scholars today call the migration state. And this is a term that captures the central function of the modern bureaucratic state in controlling movement of foreigners into national territory. And yet, despite this very commonsensical quality to borders, there are many discussions and debates about the nature of the border and of immigration control and how borders work or how they're supposed to work. And we can kind of see the way that these debates get generated when we look at actual examples of border episodes or border events. And just take, for instance, some of the pictures that I have here in the slide. These are pictures of a recent surge. This was back in September, late September of this year, when about 15,000 migrants, most of them from Haiti, congregated along the US-Mexico border in the Texas town of Del Rio. And most of these were converging in Del Rio with the intention of seeking some kind of humanitarian protection. And the Biden administration very quickly organized deportation flights from Del Rio or from Texas to Haiti, even though most of these migrants had actually been living in Latin America for years, in South America and Mexico. And this was under a Trump-era executive order that closed the US border to all entries because of COVID. And so close to 2,000 people were deported by plane by around September 27th. And this was around the same time that there was a video of Border Patrol agents on horseback chasing down Haitian migrants who were trying to cross the Rio Grande and shouting obscenities at them. But quietly, the Biden administration was also paroling thousands of Haitians into the United States. And it wasn't entirely clear on what basis they were paroling these migrants, like which ones they were deporting and which ones they were allowing to remain in the country. Although it seemed that maybe some priority was being given to families. And these migrants were being shuttled by bus to other cities in Texas to be processed. Some of them were being flown, and they were landing in these other cities, and they were being cared for, in many cases, by voluntary agencies. Those with family members in the US were generally permitted to join their family members pending a what's called an NTA, or a notice to appear, which is a notice to appear in an immigration court at a later date. So when you look at this situation overall, what do you make of this? What is this situation telling us about borders and about the policies of what we call the migration state? So a lot of popular discourse frames the situation in Del Rio as evidence of the loss of control over the border. This idea of broken borders and the incapacity of states to regulate mobility. And different versions of this discourse, they can be found among both liberals and conservatives in the United States. And there's also an important version of this in academic literature that suggests that liberalism, in a variety of ways, makes border control very difficult. Now, others view this situation in a completely different way, as kind of evidence of like a nonstop assault by the state against immigrants, and evidence of the kind of ever more ingenious ways that states block entry, and the callous disregard that wealthy states like the United States have for migrants. Now, within these discussions, there is a tendency to reify the state, to kind of take the state as a given, to identify this kind of cohesive entity that's operating, or that's supposed to operate in according to some kind of discernible and a central logic. And this is understandable and it's justifiable. In the United States context, the federal government has had plenary power over immigration since the 1870s. So really the federal government has total legal control over immigrant admissions, over border control, over deportation, over the creation of migrant categories. And there's this enormous bureaucratic infrastructure and an increasingly militarized infrastructure around immigration that's located mostly within the Department of Homeland Security. And, the very name Homeland Security just kind of screams out modern nation state, modern state control over mobility and over mobile bodies. But in this talk, I want to advocate a somewhat more relational, networked understanding of political power. And I want to think about the way that power is exercised by flesh and blood actors, people whose mundane activities are what's actually giving shape to a territorialized polity. So I want to kind of look at Border Patrol agents and ICE agents and judges and lawyers and advocates, but also things like teachers and doctors and employers, right? Even church pastors, which is somewhat what my earlier work has focused on. So elements of this network might be acting in a coordinated fashion, but the network as a whole it's not singular and it's not really unitary. And this allows us to focus on inconsistency and arbitrariness and indeterminacy. To see that this isn't really a defect of the migration state, it's something that we should actually expect when we look at the state. So I'm going to try to flesh out some of these ideas in the context of the U.S. Asylum system. Asylum in the U.S. has received a lot of attention in the European context and in the UK for several, a couple decades now at least, but not so much in the United States. And the growing contentiousness and the growing salience of asylum doesn't really come into play in the US until around 2015. And so it's an opportunity, I think, to think a little differently about borders and about immigration control and migration management. This is very much a work in progress, and a lot of the ideas I'm articulating here are not new. These have been circulating among geographers and in the social sciences more broadly for a number of years now. But I am trying to kind of cobble together some of these ideas and hopefully give some fresh insights into what we call the migration state. So this migration state, what is this? This term, I'm not sure if it was actually coined by James Hollifield, but he certainly seemed to popularize it. And I actually did a quick search on Google Scholar, and the term migration state really does not even appear at all. I searched from 1980 to 2000, and it doesn't appear. But boy, after 2004, it gets cited a lot. It's kind of a very commonly used term in the migration literature. And in the article, he's arguing that along with defense and trade, migration management has become one of the central features of the modern state. It's kind of a core feature, core thing that the modern state does. But he also described the modern liberal state as kind of trapped in this and he uses the term trapped in a liberal paradox. And it manifests itself in large scale in migration, in spite of popular anti-immigrant sentiment. And in this article, he's really synthesizing what had been years of writing about immigration and border politics that in a variety of ways had described these features inherent to liberalism that make it impossible to stop migration. And he identified a number of features: human rights norms that prevent large-scale deportation, liberal norms that extend rights and expand citizenship to foreigners, the workings of liberalized markets, the demands for employers for workers, and liberal political systems that are prone to special interest group pressures that kind of favor expansionism. So the liberal paradox is this fundamental tension between openness and integration that's demanded by liberal markets and that's welcomed by sort of liberal elites on the one hand, and then the sort of cultural closure and security that's required to sustain sovereignty and a national polity. And he sees this as this kind of constant, inherent tension within liberal states. And so what he argues is that the fix for this is really sort of intensive migration management. And these are sort of bureaucratic actions that include regional cooperation agreements to try to control migration and to select migration, but not really to stop it entirely. And an important theme that he raises in all of this is that that many of these measures and many of these actions are in fact symbolic. That again, they don't really stop migration, but they kind of maintain what he says, maintain the illusion of control. So borders really become a form of kind of political theater in a way. Now, there's this whole other body of literature that's kind of in conversation with this migration state literature, but another kind of set of discussions that call into question this idea of border control as mere political theater. And that also question this idea of the borders of liberal states as being really porous. And so there's a vast literature on border externalization, neo-refoulement, the extensive use of readmission agreements, the use of biometric technologies, various forms of border offshoring. Like on the one hand, these ideas, they complicate the idea of a singular territorial border, but they suggest at the same time that there is this really robust state, and that this robust state has a capacity to preempt, to deter, to stop mobile bodies, and to render them very precarious. So, you know, these are obviously very different perspectives on the power of territorialized states to regulate human mobility, but they're kind of similar in their attention to physical borders and also to immigration restriction. And they share this idea of a kind of a more or less unified state that is an actor with a will and a capacity, more or less a capacity to exercise its will. They both suggest a somewhat stable quality to immigration and border politics. And they also both kind of assume that there's a central logic that's governing how states behave. But this is really what I want to challenge, this sense that there's this kind of relatively cohesive and coherent state. And I'm drawing here on critical theorizations of the state that have argued that we need to look at the state not so much as a thing, but as a form of power that works through societal relationships and also social institutions. And this literature has kind of talked a little bit more about stateness as a quality rather than the state per se as a thing. And stateness involves like a whole range of practices and dynamics that don't necessarily follow a particular or consistent logic. This line of thinking also tries to dismantle any separation that that's imagined between the state and society. Now, in the case of immigration, I think a fruitful way of thinking about this is through the concept of alienage, and I borrow this term from Linda Bosniak, who's a legal studies scholar. And her work, she's in legal studies, so she's focusing a lot on laws as well as government policy. But she focuses, or she talks not so much about the state as about the political community and how the political community produces itself in relation to aliens and alienage. And I know that talking about aliens is a little jarring. In the United States, to talk about like illegal aliens is seen as very pejorative, and so we tend not to use like to use this term alien. But alienage, in fact, kind of in a legal sense, is referring to the presence of foreigners within national territory, kind of in the presence of the political community. And so having alienage. Having aliens within the political community raises a lot of questions about how far the rights and status of citizenship can and should extend. And she makes the point that we cannot take the boundaries of the political community for granted. So, what she says is, in terms of kind of talking about the political, you can't think about the political community without considering, and these are her words, the logically prior questions of how those boundaries are established and enforced, and how that membership is constituted in the first place. So instead of kind of taking the political community as a kind of an a priori given, it's sort of looking at the way that we're forming the political community always in relation to alienage, right, to the presence of aliens. And she talks about this idea of threshold questions, which I find really interesting. And these threshold questions relate to how, kind of where and how we set the limits of the polity. And I want to suggest that alienage can be a more productive way than even territorial borders to think about stateness. So what are the collective processes and decisions by which a whole variety of actors designate people as foreigners and extend or withhold rights from them? And this kind of politics, I think, is a lot messier and a lot more politically ambiguous than the idea of the liberal paradox. And it's also, I think, messier and a lot more ambiguous than some of the discussions around border externalization as well. So I certainly don't mean to dismiss the concept of borders altogether, but I do want to complicate how they work. And I just cite here some of the literature around the idea of border work. I think has been somewhat helpful. A lot of this concept of border work focuses on these everyday practices through which, again, a whole variety of actors, ones that we associate with the state and ones we might call non-state actors, that they kind of get enlisted into this work of parsing rights and privileges of membership within a national polity. And they kind of give shape to these ideas about assimilability and sovereignty and security and so on. So those are some of the ideas that I'm working with here, and what I really want to kind of explore are how these actors are different actors are kind of thinking about deservingness, worthiness, how they sort of put this into action, and all the sorts of often bureaucratic processes. But again, these are not just involving. So there are kind of elements within these, if we want to talk about the asylum system, there are elements of that system that work in coordination and in concert with each other. But at the same time, there's a lot of instability, and a lot of it really comes across when you look kind of in detail at how the system works, how these different actors put this into practice. That seems really arbitrary, very ad hoc. And again, very unstable. So I just want to talk a little bit about the U.S. asylum system. The current system that we have in the United States, the formal framework governing asylum was created with the 1980 Refugee Act. This set up a formal refugee resettlement program. And at the same time, it attempted to depoliticize the asylum process by evaluating individual cases on their own merits. So what it did basically was it took the kind of 1951 Refugee Convention language and it put that into US law. And before this time, US asylum policy had been very tied up with Cold War prerogatives. Basically, we would allow in anybody escaping from a communist regime. There were a number of controversies in the 1980s and 1990s around asylum. There was a case in the 1990s where there were thousands of people coming, kind of fleeing from US-financed civil conflict in Central America. We had sort of a Haitian boat people crisis and then a Cuban boat people crisis. So there have been a number of these crises through the kind of mid-90s. But from around 1995 to 2015, you really didn't hear very much about asylum or about refugees. And the numbers of asylum seekers were generally very low, especially compared to other forms of immigration in the United States. We have strict caps on refugee resettlement. And that meant that the United States really never had to kind of deal face to face with the fallout of US interventions in the Middle East, right? I mean, we just never had to deal with it. So it just was never controversial. So there were very, very low numbers of resettlement. So there were some instances where refugee settlement became contentious at a very local scale and very sort of localized politics. That's been, there's been some discussion around in the literature, but this wasn't really kind of on the national radar. And that really starts to change around 2015. And it's kind of bubbles up out of this sort of larger context of anti-immigrant sentiment in the US, which has been a perennial feature of American society, but it kind of waxes and wanes. But a very kind of a virulent expression of nativism emerged during the Obama administration that was connected to and sort of fueled by a lot of conspiracy theories, including birtherism. And some of you might have heard of birtherism. This was the belief that President Obama was not born in the United States and was not an American citizen and was therefore an illegitimate president. This, of course, was being promoted by Donald Trump at the time. Now, in fact, Obama had implemented really aggressive deportation policies that brought legal enforcement well into the interior of the country. But many Americans, especially older white conservatives, they had a very heightened sense that borders were broken, that there were criminal aliens coming in, and that they were sort of infiltrating this very insecure or unsecured border. And it was in this context that media images began to appear of millions of Syrians fleeing the Syrian civil war and arriving in Europe. And the Obama administration announced that it would accept 100,000 Syrians for resettlement, which of course is a puny, a tiny, tiny number. But it nonetheless caused this huge firestorm among social conservatives that there were soon going to be floods of potential terrorists coming into the country. And some of this was tied into kind of a longer running fears in the United States, especially in like really conservative parts of the country, about the infiltration of Sharia law. And we can get into this in discussion. It's kind of hard to explain where this came from, but there were in fact these fears about Sharia law, and lots of anti-Sharia laws were being passed at the state level. So at the same time that the Syrian thing was going on, there were these large kind of quote unquote migrant caravans, large numbers of people from Central America making their way to the southern US border to claim asylum. And this, of course, was feeding into long running narratives about broken borders and fears of replacement theory and all this kind of thing. And it's sort of the coalescence of these episodes. This really propelled Donald Trump into the White House. And he had a very brazenly kind of anti-immigrant message, the sort of build the wall message that really signaled this kind of decisive shift in the Republican Party toward a much more nativist anti-immigrant line. Now, to kind of get a sense of what Trump did to like how he shaped the asylum system, I just kind of very briefly tell you how asylum works, and this is only one element of asylum that's called defensive asylum. And basically, anybody who comes across the border without a proper visa, it's considered an unauthorized entry, and you're immediately put into expedited deportation proceedings. But if you claim that you have a fear of persecution, you go into this thing called a credible fear hearing. And while you're being processed for a credible fear screening, you're normally brought to a detention facility in the interior of the country, and then you're interviewed by a special asylum agent. And if you're found to have credible fear, then you have a notice to appear in court, and then you go before an immigration judge who will decide if your case is valid. Now, under Obama, as the system became a little bit more overloaded, they started to bypass the credible fear hearing, and they started practicing what's called catch and release, where if you were apprehended at the border but you claimed credible fear, or you claimed fear of persecution, then if you were not considered a flight risk, or if you had young children with you, or if you had family in the United States where you could stay with, they would basically just release you into the country and give you a notice to appear before a court. Okay, so that was called catch and release policy. So what Trump really fundamentally altered a lot of this. And he came up with a whole bunch of different ways of kind of cracking down on asylum. So basically, just a few examples of this: any alien apprehended for unauthorized entry. So anybody who did not come to a legal port of entry, but who just tried to cross the border, like kind of in a random crossing point, like in the desert, they would immediately be deported. If a deportable alien expressed an intent to request asylum, sorry, hang on a second. So there was this kind of deportation of any kind of unlawful entry. And then there's this kind of classic border externalization going on that we hear about a lot in the literature. So safe third country provisions, they completely end catch and release, right? So it's automatic detention. Family separation policies as a way of ensuring that you could hold adults in detention for longer periods of time. And then something called the migration protection protocols, where instead of being released into the country, you would be released to Mexico, where people were sort of having to stay in these really squalid conditions and these sort of, just very bad conditions in Mexico. So it's all this kind of offshoring, this sort of border externalization going on. And then COVID was this wonderful opportunity for the Trump administration to basically end asylum. I mean, more or less, to basically turn away most unauthorized aliens at the border. And they, used COVID to kind of expel around 500,000 aliens after around 2020, the year 2020. But there's a lot of other stuff kind of going on here that's really interesting. You get the Department of Homeland Security is given, they give the Border Patrol itself more authority to kind of decide whether they're going to actually deport people or not deport people. So it's left up to border agents who are not trained asylum reviewers to make purely subjective decisions about whether, in fact, they're going to deport people or whether they will allow them. So there's a lot of this kind of arbitrariness that's built into this, where they're kind of empowering these border agents to do this. They also start to alter what counts as credible fear. And the Attorney General's office starts to kind of come up with other benchmarks, other thresholds for deciding whether a judge or whether a border agent or whether an asylum agent should even fathom allowing somebody into the country. So instead of saying credible fear, they have to have reasonable fear. And later on, whether torture would be more likely than not if someone were returned. And then, despite this kind of push toward deportation, again, agents are able to pull people out of that process on completely arbitrary basis, right? So, the big question is, who's making these decisions? On what basis are they making these decisions? And there's no sort of clarity, there's no guidelines, there's nothing at all written about how this has to work. So there's a very strong kind of subjective element to all of this. Now things get really interesting when we start to look at the judicial system. And if after all of this, people do get their hearing, right? So like, let's say you do get to the point where you're able to appear before a judge and to make your case that you are deserving of asylum, there's a whole set of case law and a whole set of rules being passed down by the Attorney General office, rules that are constantly changing about what counts as a particular social group. And this concept of particular social group is coming from the language of the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, right? And so it's coming from the U.S. courts, though, how they're distinguishing someone as coming from a particular social group. And at times, since the 1980 Refugee Act, this has been interpreted in wildly different ways. In some cases, in a very restrictive way, to emphasize the point that this system is not just for people who are any random person escaping from violence, right? There's lots of people in the world who are escaping from violence, and we don't have any obligation toward those people. People have to be coming from a specifically identifiable group. Now, at other times, it's been interpreted more broadly to mean that, for instance, an identifiable group would include those who have experienced gender violence, female genital mutilation, forms of domestic violence, people sort of persecuted on the basis of sexual identity, people who are subject to gang violence, right? So at times the interpretations are kind of all over the place. And the key point here is that these interpretations are happening at the same time. So at the same time that, for instance, the Obama administration had these really restrictive, had these kind of more open readings of it to emphasize, say, gender violence, it was also kind of creating rules that that social groups have to be readily recognizable by others. So how do you do that, right? And that's a very arbitrary thing, because you've got a bunch of judges who have no idea about the context people are coming from and whether they are in fact readily recognizable in the context where they're coming from, right? So there's this whole sort of arbitrary basis to making these sorts of decisions. Under the Trump administration, he rolls back a lot of the domestic violence and sexuality stuff, saying that those people are in fact victims of private violence. That's not a distinctive category. But as it turns out, very different decisions are being made in some of the different circuit courts. So like the Seventh Circuit Court in Chicago, they had their own set of case law where they were sort of using different standards even than what the Attorney General was setting out. So when you look at the judicial system, it's just kind of, there's a lot of chaos to it. And this really comes out when you look at sort of the approval and denial rates in different court systems around the country. So there's this enormous unevenness in how the courts are deciding whether people are sort of legitimate and whether, whether they have this kind of legitimate claim to membership in the American polity. So for instance, you get denial rates in places like Atlanta and Charlotte of over 80% are being denied in court. But then you look in places like Chicago and New York and Newark and Philadelphia and San Francisco and Phoenix, and in these courts, you get much higher rates of acceptance of these cases, right? I know it's probably impossible for you to see what's on that little chart there, that graphic. So the website's there if you want to show. Now, what's really, really interesting here in all of this, with all these disparities, is the way that immigration advocates and immigration lawyers are approaching all of this. And so you get a number of advocacy groups and a lot of organizations like Lutheran Resettlement Services, Catholic Resettlement Services, that are all producing documents and publishing documents that instruct lawyers how to deal with particular courts, right? How to frame the cases to meet the constantly shifting standards and the uneven standards within particular circuits, and also the difference, the kind of back and forth from the Attorney General's office. So basically, how do you frame a person's case? What's going to work when you go before a particular judge or you're in a particular circuit? How do you make sure that you're adhering to certain precedents in certain courts? How do you say the right things about who this person is, right? And so, and part of this also, part of the equation here that I don't have time to get into is that immigrants who appear before these courts, they don't actually have a right to legal counsel. So this isn't a regular court of law like in the United States, where you have the right to a publicly provided attorney. In immigration court, there is no such right. So, so that also raises the questions about how the asylum seekers themselves have to learn how to present themselves as sort of worthy victims, how they position themselves as deserving of a place in the polity, how they kind of argue their own case, or how lawyers on their behalf might be arguing that they should have an opportunity to be a citizen. What sorts of trauma are they kind of forced to convey and to repeat in order to negotiate their membership? This slide here is showing you one of these documents from an advocacy center about, this is specifically about the Seventh Circuit Court and how you're supposed to kind of approach the Seventh Circuit Court. And then I know I'm running out of time here, so just really quickly, the final point that I want to make here is that there are these other routes to negotiation. So if not through the asylum system, there are all these sort of other categories of partial membership that that we've created with different thresholds. And again, I like this idea of thresholds and thresholding. They kind of offer different measures of deservingness, different ways of conceiving of the value of particular people to the polity. And I've just sort of listed a couple of these here. You've got these. Let's say that you fail in your asylum case and you're sort of put into this deportation system. You can file waivers for inadmissibility and basically say that you've got certain hardships. And there are lists of hardships, and there are tier 1 hardships and tier 2 hardships. And you have to kind of know how to present yourself within these different categories. There's also these U visas that are for victims of criminal activity who cooperate with law enforcement. And for one of these, you have to get a law enforcement officer or an FBI agent to basically support your case and to show how you've cooperated with law enforcement. And there's temporary protected status, and there's a whole other kind of these whole other systems that lay out these different terms and conditions, and that have got different rights attached to them as well. I don't have time to go over this very much, but I've kind of given a couple screenshots here of looking at the Homeland Security website that shows kind of the basis. This is for the U non-immigrant visa to eligibility, and there's like this whole list of ways that you've been victimized, and how like if you kind of fit into these particular categories of victimization. You've been involved in some kind of criminal activity, but you've cooperated. Those are the basis on which you can kind of claim at least a partial stay. And then this is the application for the waiver. I kind of this image is sort of interesting in showing when you look on all of these visa pages, you'll see alert, 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 and there's whole lines of these alerts, depending on what different courts have said and different decisions coming down, right? Because the rules around them, they're constantly changing, and so there's this constant string of alerts where the rules have changed. And this one's describing particular rule changes around public charge rules. That's a whole other issue. I don't have time to get into it. So, but just some concluding thoughts here. So when we talk about immigration, it's hard not to talk about the state and its territorial borders. Immigration regimes are encoded in laws. They're implemented through bureaucratic agencies. We can see very visibly the power of the state and its territoriality whenever we go to a port of entry. But I've tried to think here a little bit differently about the migration state, to consider the migration state less as a centralized and cohesive thing that sits apart from society and more as a diffuse set of power relationships that's pervading society. And indeed, it's forming society itself. Stateness enlists the actions and support of many different kinds of actors. I've tried to also highlight here the idea of alienage is central to stateness, perhaps even more than territorial borders. The idea of the migration state revolves around the question of whether territorial boundaries are keeping people out. But I don't think that question is really fundamental to understanding stateness. And I'm much more interested in the way that we narrate and perform and produce distinctions between citizen and alien, and how these distinctions shift over time, and how we require aliens to undertake certain performances. So as long as aliens are physically present, then we've got sort of non-members within the polity. And it's kind of in that really ambiguous and contentious situation that I think we start to see the sort of arbitrariness and ad hocness, and both the rigidity and the flexibility of the state. I'm going to end there. I know I've run over, so I'll open it up. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. And I think the floor is now open for questions. If you want to ask something, please do feel free to use the hand function, raise your hand, turn your cameras on, turn your mic on, and we will invite you to the screen. I'm certain we will have some questions from our audience, and whilst we wait for questions to come in, I have a question for Caroline. Given the arbitrariness in the process of asylum adjudication, I think a great deal of disparity is inevitable. So does this mean the refugees must learn to live with the unequal justice?
Yeah, definitely. You know, geographers have talked quite a bit about the very different experiences migrants have depending on what part of the country they're in. And there is this unevenness within the US, and you see this in Europe as well, and I'm sure in the UK, you know, where, you know, some cities declaring themselves sanctuary cities, and with very different kind of relationships between sort of municipal governments and advocacy organizations and law enforcement. And you're going to get a very different set of experiences there than you do in a place like South Carolina, where I live, right? So yeah, you're definitely living with that unevenness.
Okay. So as you mentioned before, is that there is the asylum is have the to seek protection from the reasons like related with the gender, with the race and the religions, and some kind of question, issues. So, but I think there are some other refugees is not included in the protection areas. It's like due to the climate change, I think, and the natural disasters caused by that has caused 1 million people to migrate from their home country. And but such kind of environmental refugees is there are not any protections for them.
Yeah, correct. Or very certainly not through the asylum system, and that actually has been pretty consistent throughout. That people who are just sort of displaced because of disasters or, you know, conflict, there's no sort of humanitarian right to that per se. However, there is a status in the United States called temporary protected status. And that is sometimes extended to people, usually people who are already in the country where there's been like a big earthquake or a hurricane, but it's a very tenuous status. it can be like 6 months or it can be a year, and sometimes it will get renewed, but sometimes it's not. And again, it's completely, arbitrary, like the whole process around which groups kind of get that TPS and which don't. That's a whole other kettle of fish, right? About how that TPS, and the Trump administration tried very hard to eliminate it altogether. He tried to deport. There had been Haitians living in the country for a decade on TPS, and he tried to deport them all. So it's a very tenuous situation.
Thank you so much. And I think we have a hand up from Anthony. So Anthony, thank you. Please go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. I had a question about sort of sorts of refugees and sort of how they're dealt with in the US system. So I'm more familiar with the Canadian one, and there'll be sorts of, well, I'm not sure how it works exactly with the kind of UNHRC or whatever they're called refugees and how they're sort of admitted, but we would have a distinction between sort of sponsored refugees that various parties will say like, oh, those are the ones we really want because they're better integrated, but they tend to be kind of like at sort of a private individual's dime sort of for supporting, versus the ones that are admitted by the state and where there's sort of a little bit more like that link between the new arrival and the state. So I don't know if those sorts of distinctions exist in the US or how they've sort of developed over time, but I was wondering if you might be able to.
Not quite as much as you see in Canada, where it's almost like individuals can sponsor people. In the US, the general resettlement thing is similar in that what happens is that the UNHCR, it's a very offshore kind of system where the UNHCR is in the kind of actual refugee context, and they're identifying kind of the most, again, who's making these decisions, the most vulnerable refugees, and then they get selected for resettlement, and they get brought. And in the US, there's a strict cap on that, and that cap is kind of set by mainly by that the president sets a cap each year for how many they'll accept. Then those are funneled into sort of voluntary organizations, often church-based, that are kind of official contractors with the federal government. So we don't have the kind of private sponsorship. It's all going through these agencies. So it's similar, but there's also some differences in between the US and Canada. And the US sort of had been the world's kind of biggest refugee resettler. But lately the numbers have plummeted. And part of that was from the Trump administration, just really cut the cap on that.
Very interesting. And it's also, yeah, the other big debate that had come up in Canada, at least over the Trump years, was this sort of like third-party safe haven or whatever it was called, and like people sort of crossing the border where they're not allowed to cross the border into Canada from the US, and all of this sort of, whether or not those people were actually in a safe haven became a big issue. But, but this is all very interesting. Thank you very much for the time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Anthony. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And and Professor, do you think in the past 20 months has the asylum adjudication or the asylum seekers been affected by the COVID? Is maybe for the U.S. government to reduce the number of successful cases to limit the refugees' mobility, something like that, or something you think from from UK?
Definitely during the Trump administration, they cut a lot using COVID. They made use of a 1943 public health law. Maybe it was, I think, 1943. They sort of dug up this law that had not been invoked for decades, that talked about public health emergency, and they used that basically to greatly kind of constrain people moving through ports of entry. And so yeah, there was, but there were still people coming through at the discretion of those Border Patrol agents. So yeah, you know, the numbers had kind of, I actually have, I kind of kept, these are border apprehensions. This isn't necessarily asylum, but these are just people kind of crossing borders or being apprehended at the border. And you can see, you know, the number had really been, even before COVID, the numbers were going down. In 2018, there was kind of a big spike, and then it goes down again. You know, so yeah, I mean, the borders, you know, like what's going on at the border definitely matters. It's not to say that that's not important, but a lot of the kind of action is really going on once you sort of get into this process of deciding who's a member of the polity. I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have mentioned that the asylum seekers themselves have to learn how to present themselves as a sort of the victims, and this means it's like, do you think it's the obstacles they face, and that they need to maybe have to stay themselves as a very facing a very serious situation or something like that, or do you think there are other obstacles they're faced?
Well, you know, they're facing huge obstacles in doing this because it's, you know, again, they don't have any guarantee for any sort of legal counsel. So it's, you know, this is, you know, what we're trying to, and I say we because I have a colleague in sociology here, where part of what we're trying to do with this is to actually get transcripts from the court proceedings to understand, in situations where there is a lawyer present and in other situations where there's no lawyer present, how exactly they have to do this, and then to kind of figure out maybe the role that some of these voluntary agencies might be playing in, even where there's no legal counsel present, how they might be getting counseled on how to make their claim. But it's Anna Secor and Patricia Aircamp and Jenna Lloyd, they've talked about this in the context of refugee resettlement from Turkey, and the way that the way that refugees who are being screened for resettlement, the way that they have to kind of do this same thing, where they have to be believable, they have to kind of get their story straight, they have to sound confident but not too confident, you know, like there's this whole set of and you sort of wonder how that information is getting passed around, such that people know how to do this when they get into these court proceedings. So that's part of the project that we're working on right now, is to understand that.
Thank you so much for sharing insights. And I think that brings us to nearly 2 o'clock. And I think if you do find you have questions arising today and that you haven't currently thought of, you are very welcome to direct them to Caroline by email. And you can find a link to their on their faculty pages on our website. And so feel free to do so. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you so much. And
thank you all for coming. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. In particular, thank you to you, Caroline. Thank you so much. And okay, for the next, so happy Friday. Have a good weekend.